Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's so great to see you here. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Anna Bross. I am the Senior Vice President of Communications for The Atlantic, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the big story, Democracy at a Crossroads. The rise of authoritarianism and extremism, as well as related crises of disinformation and misinformation, threaten democratic norms. So where do we go from here? Today, we're hosting a series of conversations to unpack the state of democracy in America and around the world, the evolution of our political parties, and to examine the way forward. We'll explore these ideas with those who have the power to shape the fabric of our country. And now, for our first conversation, please join me in welcoming former Representative and 2024 Republican presidential candidate, Will Hurd. Here to lead the conversation is Evan Smith, an Atlantic contributing writer and co-founder of the Texas Tribune. Thank you so much.
Congressman, good to see you.
Good to see you, my friend. I'm glad we had to come all the way to D.C. to see you.
We could do this in Texas, but we're going to do it here. Everybody, hi. I want to give you a little context for our guest this afternoon. I'm so pleased to be joined on stage by Will Hurd, a candidate for the Republican nomination for president in 2024, and a former U.S. representative from the 23rd District of Texas, which stretches all the way from San Antonio to El Paso along the border and is bigger than 29 states. He was first elected to that seat in 2014 as an anomaly, a black conservative in a 71% Latino district, but was reelected twice before deciding not to run again in 2020. He entered the GOP race for the White House on June 22nd, but has failed to qualify for either of the first two debates, in part for refusing to sign the RNC pledge to back the party's nominee. I'm not going to support Donald Trump, he has said over and over and over. A native of San Antonio, Congressman Hurd is a graduate of Texas A&M University and spent 9 years working as an undercover officer for the CIA in the Middle East and South Asia. Congressman, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you, and I'm glad you've upgraded your language a little bit. Back when I was running, I don't think you called me an anomaly. I think it was like no chance in hell.
Right.
Might have been the way you articulate that. So thank you for that.
This is the Atlantic. I had to fancy it up, actually, for the Atlantic. Yeah. Congressman, let's do an update, please, on the status of your presidential campaign. 2 days ago, you put out a statement saying that your campaign was at an inflection point, right, that you were evaluating whether the campaign, in view of missing the two debates, had the resources to chart a path forward. Where are you as you sit here today?
Look, I'm still campaigning, but the question is you can't run for president without having the right resources.
Right.
And so if I run out of money, I'm going to have to evaluate. I don't think you can continue. And so we're still campaigning. I'll be in New Hampshire on Sunday and Monday. Look, being left off the first debate stage, right, there was 8 national polls that I hit the qualification for. But for one reason or the other, the RNC kept me off. Then, in these last debates, there wasn't even a qualifying poll done in Iowa the last 3 weeks, right? Yeah. Which was a place that I'd spent a lot of time campaigning. So you got to make those tough decisions. And the reality is, when it comes to presidential campaigns, Halloween is really where you got to be able to show a pathway to victory. And I'm always been honest. And if we don't see that pathway to victory, then it'll be time to think about how can I be helpful in consolidating support so that Donald Trump's not the nominee of the GOP.
Okay, well, let's stay with the former president, because there have been 2 theories of the case against Trump articulated to this point. One is he shouldn't be the nominee because he'll lose the general election. The other is he shouldn't be the nominee because he's a threat to democracy. Which is it?
It's both. The first one is because of the second one, right? Look, Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, period, full stop. And we saw that when he was president, the fact that he was unwilling to relinquish power when he knew he lost is unacceptable. And the difference this time, look, we want to discount Donald Trump because he says crazy things and he's a bit of a dummy, right? But he's gotten people that are looking at how do you disassemble the government? Like, how are you going to be able to stay in power, after 4 more years? And these are actual plans that have been written and are out there for consumption. And when you look, I talk about authoritarianism a lot. When I was in the CIA, I spent a lot of time in authoritarian countries.
Yeah.
And, I used to think, I remember when I was in school, the first class I took on international studies, the first lesson was on rule of law. And I'm like 18-year-old Will Hurd is like, rule of law? We're gonna do a whole class? Of course we have rule of law, right? That's a given. It's not a given, right? And if we look post-Cold War of how authoritarians have come to power, they've always come to power in an election, right? Hugo Chavez, Vladimir Putin, President Erdogan in Turkey. And then once they're in power, they try to disassemble those checks and balances that are used against them. They create this, that they are representing some, the action against how, normal people are being impacted.
Yeah.
They put their friends and allies in the senior law enforcement and intelligence services, right? That's how this somebody concentrates power. And this is exactly what Donald Trump is going to be doing. And for me, this is not about just, getting rid of Donald Trump or retiring Joe Biden once and for all. I want to see this experiment called America last for another 247 years. And it's not a fait accompli that's it. And I think by 2027, the steps that the Chinese government is doing, they could potentially surpass us as the sole global superpower. And if that happens, we become the United Kingdom of the 21st century. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean to, I'm not in the Senate, so I don't mean to go on for a long time.
Yeah.
But
well, I'm not going to let you, so that's fine.
But look, in middle of World War I, the UK had 50% of global GDP.
Yeah.
Now they have 3%. That exact thing could happen to us. Now, we don't have 50% of GDP now,
right.
Of global GDP. It's about 28, which is still a pretty large percentage. But that is going to impact our way of life.
Right.
And that's my concern.
And that's why we have to get it right in this election, looking ahead past that. So it's not just him, it's them, in the sense that he may be a threat to democracy, but the people around him and other people in your party are enabling
100%.
this, right? Mitt Romney told McKay Coppins of The Atlantic in a forthcoming book about Mitt Romney that he will have out, a very large portion of my party, your party, really doesn't believe in the Constitution. Do you agree?
That there are people in the Republican Party that
who do not believe in the Constitution, the very people we're talking about who are enabling that threat to democracy that you referred to.
Of course. Like, is that a hard question?
Well, it's not a hard question for me. It's your.
Right.
It's not a hard question for me. It's your party. I'm asking you to call them out.
So here's what I would say. Like, the people that frustrate me the most are the ones that know better. And let's go back to January 6th. On January 6th, that night when we voted or Congress voted to certify the election, I think it was 150-ish Republicans voted against that.
Right.
I would say 20 actually believed that there were anomalies in the vote. And let me be clear, there was no anomalies in the vote in 2020. Donald Trump lost. If Donald Trump in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan got all the votes that the Republican candidates for Congress got, he would have won by like 200,000 votes. Right? This was a free and fair and the most secure election in our history. Let me be clear about that. And there was 20 that truly believed it wasn't. The other 130 knew better, but they were too afraid to go back to their districts and answer to that in a primary, or they thought they were going to have to answer that to the primary. That's my problem with the people that are willing to get it. And these are some of the same people that in 2016 were criticizing Donald Trump for being a terrible candidate. And they were the ones calling him a rhino,
right?
At the time. And so yeah, it's scary. But there's a solution to all this. We need more people voting in primaries. That's it. 25% of the country does not vote in primary, or only, 25% of the population votes in primaries. And that's split R's and D's, half Republican, half Democrat. In a congressional seat, that's about 66,000 people per congressional seat. So ultimately, 33,000 people are deciding.
It's
most
a
of these
fraction
elections.
of a fraction of a fraction.
It's about 3% of a congressional district.
Let me ask you the pragmatic question, though, about he'll lose. Again, merely that's the argument. He'll lose. Exempt the Washington Post poll from this week that showed he was 10 points ahead. Throw that out, as most people seem to be doing. All the other polls show this to be an extraordinarily competitive race. I don't see the evidence in the polls that he'll lose. You and others who've said with certainty he'll lose, the polls are suggesting maybe you're wrong.
Look at state polls in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
You're sticking with that.
And Biden's numbers are actually higher in those places than they were in 2020. And then the other piece, right? Look, with the exception of my man Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson and I, we're the only ones that are really criticizing Donald Trump.
Right.
This was what disappointed me in the debate. I guess that was earlier this week.
2 days ago.
2 days ago. So look, I'm not a political scientist. I know there's many political scientists here. I have won some tough elections, but you don't win an election by kissing the butt of your opponent, right? And I wish.
There you go.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious.
Like a design play,
Right,
as if we planned it.
That's my wife outside on the boat. I told her to get ready, girl, get ready. But look, so what they should have done, every question, drawing contrasts with Donald Trump, right? And especially he's not there to defend himself, right? Because he's afraid. And anybody who saw the beginnings of his remarks in Michigan, he's lost a step as well. We want to talk about Joe Biden, but Donald Trump's no spring chicken either. He's long in the tooth as well. And these are the contrasts that we should be bringing. And then one of my frustrations, we got a lot of journalists here, how we're still covering Donald Trump. We're talking about it's a fait accompli. He's invincible, he can't be beat. That's bullshit. Pardon my language, right? We shouldn't accept that, right? And we all got to get in the ring. And instead of saying Joe Biden is worried about Donald Trump's changing position on abortion, the line should be Donald Trump's changing his position on abortion, and the conservative right is going to get pissed off and potentially lose him in the primary. That's what the top line should be. And so that's part of, again, look, this is, the press gets to do what the press wants to do. But the way we solve this problem is not what Democrats did in Pennsylvania and putting money and time behind a nut on the Republican side because they wanted to increase the chance the Democrat could win. This
is Doug Mastriano, who ran for governor against Josh Shapiro.
We need people that are afraid of this. The first step of defeating Donald Trump is in the primary.
Right.
And we have a narrowing period of time.
Right.
It's probably between Halloween and Thanksgiving. And so those that are afraid of that, get behind people that could pop.
Governor Chris Sununu of New Hampshire wrote an op-ed on the 21st of August, in the New York Times, in which he said, we have to defeat Donald Trump, and the way to do it is everybody has to get out of the race except for the one person in the field who can compete against him. We need this to be a one-on-one race. Otherwise, we're making the same mistake we did last time. Shouldn't you and a bunch of other people get out of the primary if that theory is correct?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I said our campaign's at an inflection point.
So you're actually considering you're considering whether the best thing to do for the country is to reduce the field to essentially Trump versus one alternative.
100%. Yeah. And look, this to me, in this race, I'm the only person that has willingly put his life on the line, his or her life on the line, to defend what I believe in, this country, right? Let me be also frank. Running for president in the first year of marriage is less than ideal.
I know your wife for a while. She would like a word, I think, actually. I
sorry, babe.
No.
But to me, look, it comes down to I was watching a little bit of General Milley's speech about his session, right?
Quite extraordinary.
The fact that a former president, let me be clear, the fact that Donald Trump said General Milley was doing something treasonous, and that back in the day, he would have been hung for that. That's treasonous, in my opinion.
That itself is treasonous.
That itself is. And to criticize a man who has spent 5 decades literally putting himself in harm's way is unacceptable. And to me, to be in a position to try to make sure that this experiment continues is important. And to talk about the issues that matter. You know, articulating why Ukraine matters, why we should be concerned about this new Cold War with China, why we should be, you know, making sure we're taking advantage of technology before it takes advantage of us. You know, these are the issues that we should be, you know, the one issue that I don't even bring up, but it's important, synthetic biology. Nobody talks about it. We can program DNA the way we program computer code. That is going to have major effects on our longevity in life, on potential biological warfare. You know, these are the big issues that requires a competition of ideas that I want to make sure we continue. And everybody around the world is watching, and they expect something better from us. And we cannot continue this experiment without having friends and allies.
So I want to talk about the substance of a campaign like yours and how it gets back to this question of what is a Republican and what is a conservative, or who is a Republican and who is a conservative today. I remember your time in Congress, Congressman. You only voted with Donald Trump 81% of the time when you were in Congress, which is among the lowest Trump scores among all Republicans during those years. And some examples so people understand exactly who you are and what you believe. You supported background checks for guns. You were one of only 8 Republicans to do so. You opposed diverting. You opposed diverting.
Come on, y'all. You know. Just for the answer, if I had gotten asked that question on the debate stage about how you deal with gun violence, my answer would have been a little bit different.
You would not have been encouraging applause in the audience, right?
Yeah.
You opposed diverting money from its allocated purpose to pay for the border wall. You were one of only 14 Republicans to do that. You supported a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who came to the U.S. as children, and you opposed a ban on transgender Americans serving in the military. My question is there room in the Republican Party for someone like you these days? Because those are the kinds of positions that get you called a rhino or worse.
Yeah, there's a room.
Where is the room?
Because here's how I define the Republican Party. Like most people have a very narrow definition. It's whoever the avatar of that moment is of the party. And right now, it's Donald Trump.
It's a Trump party, right?
There's no question about that. I'll admit that. Or others say, who are the senior most elected officials? So it could be Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, and let's add a couple of governors. And they would put Ron DeSantis in there as well.
Right.
I don't think it's that. My definition of the Republican Party is somebody who would vote for a Republican. So that's a very broader issue. Now, the problem is, you know, let's call it the Hurd wing of the Republican Party is not dead. It's wounded. There's no question about that. But the reason is those that believe like me are worrying about putting food on their table, a roof over their head, and making sure the people they love are healthy, happy, and safe. They do not get engaged in the process until it's already been decided that we're going to have 2 shitty options. Right? And so that is the mechanical issue there. And I said it already. If we do not have more people voting in primaries, it's not just the death of the conservative party as I define it. It's actually the death of democracy. And so that's why an engagement in the primary process, that's voting, that's getting involved in helping candidates, that's donating to candidates, that's the level of effort we need in order to make sure that we have options in November of 2024 that we have to like wring our hands about because they're like, oh, these are 2 really good options, right? We shouldn't be having to vote for the less of the evils, but that work, that engagement should be happening now. Right. And so that is, if that doesn't happen, then yes, you're gonna see less folks like Will Hurd.
Yeah. I remember when you got out of the race in 2020, when there was an assumption you would run for re-election and you declined to do it, you said a couple things about your party. One thing you said is if the party doesn't start looking like America, there will not be a party. You have the most diverse slate of candidates running in the Republican primary this time. That's progress. And yet, at the same time that you have multiple Black and South Asian candidates running, this is the party whose leader, whose front runner, is the candidate of stand back and stand by.
Yeah, sure.
Who let the white supremacy toothpaste out of the test tube. How does that allow you to say this party has a future in attempting to reach voters in communities of color?
Well, you left a section off of what I also said.
Yeah.
I said the party needs to look like America, but it also needs to not be an asshole, a racist, a misogynist, a homophobe, right?
Yes.
And so that is how we're going to survive. The Republican Party, it's been 20 years since we've won a national election.
Popular vote.
Popular vote.
Right.
Popular vote.
Right.
If the Electoral College didn't exist, you would not have seen a Republican. And so we need to accept that. The fact that in 2022, there was not this red wave that polling suggested was going to happen. The fact that even the weekend before that election, there were a number of these polling groups that we look to as if they're the word of God, said that Kevin McCarthy was going to have a 30-person majority.
Right.
In 2020, right, the lesson of that election was don't be a jerk, don't be a socialist, right? And so the Republican Party, we can go all the way back to the autopsy of 2012 when the senator from Mitt Romney, when Mitt Romney lost, about what we need to do in order to broaden the party. And we actually have an opportunity in 2024 because Democrats and independents are frustrated with the direction of the Democratic Party. And so if we put somebody forward that would be able to articulate a message to that group, we could be seeing some we would be talking about more than just Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. So, but will we be able to get there and have enough people get there? No, because they're only focused on 3% of the.
I mean, Congressman, my question is, if a Black voter comes up to you on the street and says, tell me why I should vote Republican in view of the last 5 or 6 years, or a Hispanic voter comes up to you and says, tell me why I should vote Republican, what's your answer?
Well, I would tell them, vote for me.
Right.
Okay.
All right.
And here's why you should vote for me. Right. And I always articulate that my message is different than a lot of the other folks that also have an R after their name. I would say vote for me because I believe in the separation of powers. I believe that if you concentrate power in the hands of the few, that's a problem. And so I think I actually believe in local control. There's this story going around in Texas, you know it, this neighborhood in North Texas. What's it? Colony Ridge? One more time.
Colony Ridge.
Colony Ridge, yeah, Colony Ridge. Well, you have that because the state took away power from the cities and the counties, right? Like, I believe in pushing power down to the floor.
Yeah.
I believe that everybody should have equal opportunity, regardless of your background and your race. Like, I believe that the free markets are a good thing and something that has led to people coming, rising out of poverty. I believe that we have income inequality because we have education inequality. And if we address that achievement gap, then we're not only going to see the empowerment of lives, but we're going to see an improved GDP for the country. So I believe that peace through strength, that we should be supporting the Ukrainians because if we don't support Ukraine, we need to support an international order that we create. That benefits us.
Do you see what happened today in your old stomping ground, the House, that a majority of Republicans voted against aid to Ukraine? A majority of the Republican caucus today.
Because they're afraid to go home and explain to their constituents why this matters. 5% of DOD budget, most of that is loans, and we have dismantled the Russian military without having to send our sons, daughters, and spouses over there. I think that's a pretty good deal. And the Ukrainians have done this and fought a war. A way we would never. We would never fight a war without air superiority. And we are preventing the Ukrainians from having that. But despite not having air superiority, they're bringing the Russians to bear. And so then what does that mean if we let Russia win? Eastern Europe, gone. They're back in the Russian sphere. Western Europe doesn't care what America says. They're going to continue to work with China. And this new Cold War that I've been talking about, we lose.
So the second thing you said in 2019 when you decided not to run again was you talked about young people and the Republican Party. You said if you're at the age of 40 in most places across the country, you have to whisper that you're a Republican.
Yeah.
You are one of the younger people to seek the office this time. You understand what young people, not only in Texas, but around the country, think about the big issues that motivate them to turn out. I think about climate. I think about abortion, to name two things that are going to drive, we believe, significant political engagement in this cycle. You acknowledge that climate change is something that we should be focused on. Right. But you've said that you are comfortable with a 15-week ban on abortion at the federal level. On those issues, climate and abortion, are you driving young voters toward the Republican Party or away from the Republican Party?
Well, my positions are driving people towards the Republican Party.
The 15-week ban is popular with young people?
Well, when you talk about a 15-week ban and exceptions for the life of the mother, right, and talking about how a black woman in the United States that's pregnant should not have an increased chance of death than her counterpart in the developing world,
right.
That's unacceptable. And when you talk about those issues, people appreciate that, right? Look, there's a reason that I have a lot of Democrats that are supportive of me because of these positions. But if you're not talking about climate and how we can address those issues and continue to grow as a country, right? Look, we're going to have to increase our amount of electricity by 50% in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
We can still use fossil fuels in a way that is not as destructive on our environment. We should also be leaders in all these other green technologies and exporting them in other places. Our foreign policy should be based on how do we help India, China, and all these other places skip their development when it comes to being able to power, turn the lights on at night. Right? There's still about 1 billion people that don't have lights at night. Right? So we can do all these things at the same time. And if you're not talking about these, or if you want to show that you're a skeptic that climate change is not real. Oh, of course it's going to get colder, right? Well, everybody says it's global warming, but it's getting colder at night. Well, you morons, there's like climate and weather are two different things, if you're not talking that way, then you're not going to get young folks. But you also got to be aspirational, right? When you're always talking about the other person's our enemy. Look, I'm sick and tired of anybody that says my neighbor is my enemy. My neighbor is not my enemy. They're just somebody that I happen to disagree with. We're fellow Americans. And so if you're not articulating that vision, then you're going to lose that younger vote. And then this trend of Republicans losing at the national level over and over is going to continue to exist. I think America deserves to have a sane conservative party. I think we have to have two parties that are engaged in a competition of ideas to solve these problems. And I want to see that. And I also know, and this is what I learned from my time representing a district that nobody thought a black Republican should represent, and that was truly a 50-50 district, 50% Republican, 50% Democrat. Way more unites us than divides us.
Yep.
And we're better together. And if we understand those principles, then I think that's how we bring young folks into the party.
We have a couple of minutes left. We spent a lot of time talking about issues and ideas on which you and the Republicans in the primary don't agree. Let's talk about one where you do agree, and that's the border. You've been quite critical of the president and this administration as it relates to the issue of the border. The fact is, you had more contiguous miles with the Mexican border in your district than any other congressional district in the country. So this is an issue on which you have actual knowledge and expertise. What is wrong at the moment, and how do we fix it?
Sure. So this crisis began under Donald Trump, and it got significantly worse under Joe Biden. And the difference between me and my other colleagues that are running for the Republican nominee is I have more time on the border than all of them combined. Actually, if you include Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And then also I know that saying crazy things is not going to solve the problem. We're not going to invade Mexico, okay? We're not going to invade our largest trading partner. Yes, the bilateral relationship between the United States and Mexico is probably the worst it's been in a really long time, but that's still no reason for invasion. The one reason this has all started, because Donald Trump put out an edict to treat everybody coming into our country illegally as an asylum seeker. Asylum is something that's real and is needed and is important and is necessary. But applying for asylum is be part of a protected class. Your government has to be persecuting you because you're part of that protected class, or the government is not protecting you from persecution from a third party because you're part of that protected class. Asylum. You don't apply for asylum because you want a better paying job.
Yep.
That's through legal immigration. And so this is what has been the pull that has had almost 6 million people come into our country illegally under President Biden. If you average $10,000, they spent $10,000 with a human smuggler per individual. That's $55 billion.
Yep.
To put that number in context, the entire U.S. intelligence budget is $60 billion. And if you, in even broader context, Starbucks, McDonald's, worldwide,
Yep.
only like $55 billion. So what do? Stop treating everybody as an asylum seeker. Only, like, State Department and our embassies overseas, they know where people are supposed to be and who are potentially being persecuted. They get special attention when it comes to asylum. And those that are coming in between our ports of entry, which is illegal, then they get deported. We should be treating human smugglers and the drug trafficking organizations as the terrorists they are. Border Patrol is selecting and gathering a lot of data on those smugglers. We should be working with our allies to dismantle that infrastructure. And this is another area where I disagree with my opponents. Foreign aid matters. And it's a fraction of the cost to address root causes overseas before the problem gets here.
Comes home.
And I'll wrap it up with this last point. And so that's how we solve this broader problem. And I'll end with this, Evan. Like, the thing that I learned from my time, overseas, America became an exceptional nation, not because of what we have taken, but because of what we have given. And when we remember, it's not only because we've given support and military support and economic aid, but we've given people an idea, right, that we are sovereign, not the government, right? And so when we get back to that notion that we are at our best when we are helping, then we're going to make sure this experiment continues for another 247 years.
Okay. Congressman, what a great conversation. Congressman Will Hurd. Thank you all, everybody.
Please welcome National Security Adviser Jake Sullivan and The Atlantic's Editor-in-Chief Jeffrey Goldberg.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks all for coming, and thank you to Jake for being here. We traveled a long distance.
Yeah, exactly.
Jake, let's start with something you were just attending, which was the change of command ceremony at Fort Myer, just over there. Mark Milley stepping down by statute after 4 years as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, CQ Brown coming in. I want to hear you on Mark Milley, but I would also note that in his farewell speech, he spoke, as he's spoken before, about the loyalty of the American officer to the Constitution, not to a king or a queen or a tyrant or a dictator. And then he ad-libbed and he said, or a wannabe dictator. So you were at the ceremony. Did you suddenly look up with interest when he said that?
I was paying extremely close attention to every word he was saying.
Obviously.
So I was completely dialed in and focused. Look, Mark Milley is somebody you deal with in real life, but you feel like you're actually at the same moment engaging somebody who's in history. Like, he's a person out of another era in a way. The way he kind of bestrides Washington, the military, the national security enterprise. And he obviously has extremely strong views about the state of American democracy, the threats to American democracy. And it's not surprising to me that he took the opportunity of his farewell to really drive a message home to the broader military and to the American people about the importance of the Constitution.
Could you assess the role that he played briefly, the role that he played in the tumultuous year of 2020 in terms of upholding the Constitution and keeping the military to the best of his ability out of politics?
Well, I actually first engaged with Chairman Milley in that transition period between President Biden's election and when he took office, and really intensely between January 6th and January 20th. And it was Chairman Milley who really kind of took over the entire exercise of ensuring that the inauguration itself came off without interruption, disruption, attack. And so I got to see him up close and personal in the days that followed January 6th, and the extent to which he was almost like had a kind of burning sense in him that he was not going to let this happen again. That what happened on January 6th, he, Mark Milley, was personally going to ensure that on his watch, the Capitol was defended, the peaceful transfer of powers defended, the early days of the new presidency was defended. That's unusual, frankly, for a chairman of the Joint Chiefs to be in a position like that,
Right.
But that's where Chairman Milley was.
And this is an interesting question. You know, the worry, the anxiety, which is shared by people in that building over there, is that the military is supposed to carry out the role, you know, in the way that we are organized. Civilians give the orders, the military carries out the orders. Does it give you any discomfort at all that in that last period of the Trump presidency, the military and some top generals had to take steps that they themselves were uncomfortable taking, or being involved in planning things that they shouldn't have been planning because of the instability of that time? I mean, you think about this a lot.
It's hard for me to answer that question with any sense of rigor, because honestly, I wasn't there. I wasn't in the room. I don't know exactly what went down or what Milley or others felt they had to do from the point of view of upholding their constitutional oath. But I will say this, Chairman Milley said today in his remarks that the Constitution is the North Star, that this is fundamentally not about an individual or political party or an ideology. It is about his oath of office. And I do believe that everything he has done throughout the time I have seen him in action has been in service of that. I would also say that he takes extremely seriously the basic job of chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that job is to provide the best military advice to the President of the United States, Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council. And the times I remember best with Chairman Milley were not meetings in the Oval Office or in the Situation Room or the crises we went through, of which there have been many, but rather just the random phone calls he would make at night to me to what he called, quote, level bubbles. Just calling Jake, this is Mark, we want to level bubbles. And he'd have his tick list of things that worried him about the world and where he was trying to give advice based on the work his joint staff had done to me and ultimately to the president. And so I think he takes the role of safeguarding the Constitution extremely seriously, but we should not lose sight of the fact that this guy day in and day out was providing his best military advice to the president at a time of great change and transformation in the world and immense pressure and challenge to American foreign policy.
Right. I want to come to the Jake Sullivan tour of the world, the things that you're worried about. That usually takes 6 to 8 hours, but we're going to try to contract it into 21 minutes. But there's something very interesting, and it's sort of a Washington observation, but we're in Washington. Mark Milley stepping down as chairman means that this is the first time in your national security cabinet that you've had a change. Now, obviously, this is remarkable given how, you know, we had a new Secretary of Defense every 12 minutes in the Trump administration. But you have the same exact team you started with: Tony Blinken, Lloyd Austin, Janet Yellen, Mayorkas, and so on. And so, how have you and how has President Biden kept that group so stable? And B, just very interested, what is it like for the CQ Brown, the new Air Force general, coming in to this very, very seasoned group now?
We're going to haze him a lot as he comes in, for one thing. I haven't warned him of that yet. I think he can probably give as good as he gets. But it's actually something he and I talked about when he came by my office a few days ago as he was getting ready to get on board, is he was asking kind of the way someone coming into a new office environment or a new school asks, hey, kind of, what's the vibe? What's the deal? Because
who's the bully?
It is, exactly. Yeah. That's Tony Blinken, the bully.
Tony Blinken.
Naturally. And the one who talks all the time is Lloyd Austin. And,
Clearly.
And on down the line. We really had to draw Mark Milley out to get him to say things. So. No, but it is true that there has been remarkable stability in the national security team, and that we have developed in a crucible of crises over 2.5 years, a sense of trust and a deep camaraderie. But of course, CQ Brown, while he hasn't been in the middle of that at the principals table, he's been a part of that broader effort as Chief of Staff of the Air Force. So he knows what he's walking into, both in terms of what's going on in the world and, frankly, in terms of what's going on in the interagency process. And he will be a great voice at the table. But it is interesting because the dynamic that we've developed, both when we sit around the table in principals meetings and the dynamic the president has developed with all of these guys. We hold a president's daily briefing, and historically that's really just been the national security advisor with either the head of the CIA or more recently the head of the director of national intelligence. I've tried to turn that into more of a almost like a mini principals committee meeting with the president, Secretary of Defense, the chairman. We recently had Secretary of Commerce in on export control issues. So there's a familiarity and a kind of feeling about this group that I think has enabled us over time to build a much stronger ability to serve the president well and hopefully serve the country well.
Right. Let's start with Ukraine. It feels like this is a moment of change. And part of the reason that feels that way is for things that are happening in this city, not on the eastern or southern fronts. And by that I mean Ukraine has become an issue in the government shutdown issue. There are a larger and larger number of Republican representatives who don't want to fund this effort anymore. And I'm wondering if you could frame out how worried you are that Ukraine on the ground is not making the progress it needs to make in order to keep apace with the American impatience calendar, let's call it that.
Look, first of all, this is about the credibility of the United States of America. We have come in to stop Russian aggression in Ukraine, and walking away from that would be a hit to our credibility. It is, also a matter of national security for the United States, because it's not just about how much more territory Ukraine takes. It's also about making sure that Russia itself can't renew an offensive that takes further territory the other direction in Ukraine and ultimately places greater pressure on NATO, which history tells us drags the United States into a conflict. So for me, the notion that the United States would stop funding Ukraine at this pivotal moment goes against every national interest of our country. And I feel there is a bipartisan foundation to build on for that. Strong support in the Senate by both parties, and in fact, strong support in the House by both parties. This is a small group of one party who is really vocal on this issue. It is not where the vast majority of members are in either house.
Except that the presumptive nominee for president of the Republican Party is aligned with that ostensibly small group in the House. That matters for the pretty near future, no?
It does, although I would point out that if you had an up or down vote on Ukraine, should we continue funding for Ukraine in the House today, just as we had one in the Senate a few days ago with overwhelming support from Democrats and Republicans, it would pass by a lot. So yes, there are procedural obstacles to getting the Ukraine funding across the line. More fundamentally, there are procedural obstacles with keeping the government open and the lights on, and that goes way beyond Ukraine in terms of the battle over the budget in the House. But I think we're at a moment now where those who support the continued defense on freedom's frontier in Ukraine do need to stand up and make the case for this. in the immediate term and then over the longer term. Because one point that I really want to emphasize is that this is not just about the votes that take place over the course of the next few days or the next week or whatever the span is. This is ultimately about us sustaining our support for Ukraine for the long term, for years, not just months, at a different level, but nonetheless for years. And we're committed to making sure that we muster the support in both parties and in both houses to get that.
Right, but stay on this topic, because part of credibility and part of being a superpower is the stability of your credibility, right? And you've spent, Tony Blinken has spent a lot of time over the last couple of years going around the world saying, hey, yeah, we had a little midlife crisis or whatever, but we're back, we're calm, we're cool, we have a strategy, we're buttressing NATO. Putin helped you buttress NATO, obviously, by reminding everyone why NATO was necessary, including Finland and countries that didn't think that previously. But what are you hearing now from your allies about our political system? I mean, you know, we have a war between authoritarianism and freedom going on, a land war, you know, in Europe. And on the Hill, they're spending a lot of time figuring out continuing resolutions just to keep the government funded. And then you've got this impeachment process starting, which is like the Seinfeld impeachment. It's literally about nothing. There's no there in the middle of it. And so, like, I'm wondering how you're staying so calm, given the fact that our allies are going to watch this and think, wait, these guys can't be. Right now, we can count on them to supply weapons to Ukraine, but God knows what's going to be next year.
Well, first, I would say that these are not babes in the woods. They're sophisticated political actors and observers. They've seen a lot of toing and froing in American politics over time. They've seen government shutdowns before over multiple administrations. Doesn't mean that it's not a credibility problem for the U.S. that we have debt ceiling crises and government shutdowns and so forth. But this is not for them some kind of new shocking thing. And so when we're engaged, you know, as I have just recently been with a number of European leaders on questions of Ukraine strategy, the government shutdown issue is not front of mind. They do want to know that at the end of the day, after all the toing and froing up on the Hill, that the support for Ukraine will continue. And we are telling them we have confidence that by hook or by crook, however things get voted on and so forth, at the end of the day, the votes are there and the support is there to make sure Ukraine keeps getting funded. Now, that leaves the question that you raise about next November. That's American democracy. That is a fixed variable. We have elections every 4 years, and I don't make any warranties or any predictions to anybody other than to say that as long as Joe Biden is president, he is going to continue to lead this country and this alliance and this broader global coalition to support Ukraine. And that is the way in which we continue to sustain the level of intensity of support that we've seen from our European partners.
Come back to Ukraine. What does Ukrainian victory look like to you? What is the definition of Ukrainian victory?
Well, first of all, Ukraine is going to define for itself what victory is, and they've been very clear about it.
But I have no Ukrainians here, so I have to ask you.
I mean, they've been very clear about what the definition of Ukrainian victory is, which is that they recover their territorial integrity and they have their full sovereignty, and that they are able to defend that sovereignty in the future against any further attacks.
But can you
and
imagine,
also that their economy and their democracy are sustained through the intense pressure that Russia is attempting to place on both of those. That is Ukrainian victory. That is what we are working towards and pushing for.
Can you imagine a situation in which you have to go to the Ukrainians and say, look, you're not getting 100% of your territory back. We could do a lot of other things for you. And do you envision a clash coming at some point if this offensive doesn't succeed in capturing 100% of what was Ukrainian territory, including Crimea?
What I can imagine is basically what the conversation that we've had from them since the beginning, which is, here's how we see the military situation. Here are the capabilities we have available and the resources we have available to give you. Here is our best advice with respect to what you've said your stated objectives are. And then ultimately, it's up to them to make the decisions about how they proceed. What we can decide is what forms of support we give them, what level of resources we give them. That's what we have worked through, and that's what we have rallied the rest of the world to do. then they have to decide how they want to proceed, both on the battlefield, where they're going to make their own choices about tactics and military objectives, and eventually through diplomacy, where again, they will make their decisions about where they go. That's not something that the United States is going to try to dictate to them.
Which country to you represents a greater threat to Western-style democracy, Russia or China?
When you say to Western-style democracy, what do you mean?
I mean the Europe-America alliance, liberal democracy, as we think of Western liberal democracy.
I think that the PRC represents a greater challenge to the basic elements of an order that have protected our interests and values for a long time, because they are looking to adjust that order in ways that benefit the PRC and come at a cost to the United States and our allies. I think more acutely, Russia represents a much more direct military threat to Europe, and a direct military threat to Europe is a military threat to the United States, because history has told us we would get engaged. So I think one is a greater long-term strategic challenge for the United States. The other is a more acute, immediate threat to the United States and our allies. And fundamentally, our strategy has to account for both of those at the same time, while also recognizing that geopolitical competition is not the only thing going on. It's not the only game in town in the world. We also have an age of interdependence with massive transnational challenges, climate change being top among them, where we have to rally cooperation of the nations of the world, including the aforementioned nations, certainly the PRC. And somehow we've got to have a strategy that accommodates all of that. That is what we've worked for over the course of the past 2.5 years.
Do you think that there's a non-zero solution to climate change, in the sense that, do you think you're going to have to give China something more, a greater feeling of dominance in the Pacific in order to get concessions on climate?
I think the PRC would like that, but the answer to that question is an emphatic no. The United States, at least as long as Joe Biden is president, is not going to view climate as a hostage in strategic or diplomatic negotiations to be given up only through the concession of something else. But we will be available for a serious conversation about how, as the two largest emitters, we can work together to reduce our own carbon emissions and also to deploy the necessary resources and technologies for the rest of the world to do it too. It's really incumbent on China to come to the table to participate in that, and not to say we'll only do so if you hand us some concession and some other thing. That kind of linkage, that kind of hostage taking, does no one in this world a service, and that dog's not going to hunt with respect to the United States.
Right. You said that a Russian aggression against Europe would be a direct national security threat to the United States. Would a Chinese aggression, PRC aggression against Taiwan, represent a direct national security threat to the United States?
Well, actually, the Taiwan Relations Act, which was passed in 1979, says that a unilateral change to the status quo, an attack on Taiwan, is a matter of grave concern to the United States. That's actually written into the law.
But matter of grave concern can mean a lot of different things.
Well, one thing that it means is that that kind of instability, that kind of conflict in the Indo-Pacific across the Taiwan Strait would have absolutely catastrophic effects for the global economy. And people use the word catastrophic a lot for a lot of things, but we're talking potential Great Depression level impacts if you actually had that kind of conflict, for one. For another, it would mean tens of millions of people under direct military threat in a place that is trying to have a democracy and to sustain peace and stability. And it would also mean, at that point, further challenges to the overall security architecture of the Indo-Pacific, which directly implicates the interests of our treaty allies. So the entire object of our approach on the issue of Taiwan is to maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, is to ensure that the hypothetical that you're pointing at, a potential war there, never comes to pass. That's what we are committed to. That is why we are taking the steps we are taking to try to create the deterrence and the diplomatic context necessary to ensure there is not a war over Taiwan.
Do you think that the Chinese are looking at American support for Ukraine and saying, oh, maybe they're still serious about protecting democracies?
It's hard for me to characterize exactly how Beijing is seeing it. What I can tell you is that I believe strongly that if the United States walked away from Ukraine, would-be aggressors elsewhere would think, man, I might have a better shot to go after my particular target.
Do you think that the U.S. pulling, goes back to probably the most controversial act, foreign policy act of the Biden administration, think the U.S. withdrawing completely from Afghanistan and the Taliban coming into Kabul, do you think that sent a signal to authoritarians that they overinterpreted?
If you're asking, do I think that us withdrawing from Afghanistan led Putin to invade Ukraine, my answer to that is no, I do not.
Not linking them that directly, but the messaging got muddled, no?
I mean, I'd say a couple things about that. First, when the United States had hundreds of thousands of troops deployed in both Iraq and Afghanistan, Putin invaded Georgia. When the United States was deep in it in Afghanistan with no end in sight, Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014. And his decision to invade Ukraine in 2022, in hindsight, stretches well back before August of 2021. So no, I do not think there's a connection between the two things in terms of Putin's decision-making. I do think there is a connection between those two things in terms of America's position and capacity to respond in Ukraine. If we were still in Afghanistan, in numbers, under threat from the Taliban, our troops being killed, being wounded, our ability to put the strategic focus and emphasis, and NATO's ability to do that, would be less. And also, you can bet that Russia would be using every opportunity it had with the Taliban to try to use Afghanistan as a way to go after us, go after our forces, our troops, to try to hold us back in Ukraine. So us not still being at war after 20 years in Afghanistan has improved our strategic capacity to deal with Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and I believe it's improved our strategic capacity to deal with the challenge of the PRC in the Indo-Pacific as well.
Your administration is providing more and more, on a regular basis, more and more sophisticated weapons to Ukraine. What is the anxiety level about Russian response to that? I mean, obviously, Russia's a large nuclear power. Do you fear that providing too much in the way of offensive weaponry to Ukraine could escalate tensions between Russia and the U.S. in an unacceptable way? Sort of taking the temperature of that issue right now.
It's a great question. It's a question that keeps me up at night, and if it didn't keep me up at night, I should be fired, because that is a serious, high-stakes question. Now, the debate in Washington has basically broken down into two competing extremes. One that says you're a chicken if you even contemplate Russian escalation or nuclear use. How could you even think about that? That just makes you a weenie. That's kind of one argument on one extreme. The other extreme says, don't do anything to help Ukraine because it'll automatically mean World War III. And the answer, as with most things, lies in between those two, where we have to contemplate and take into account the potential for escalation on the one hand, and on the other hand, we cannot be paralyzed by that, and we have not been paralyzed by that to the tune of a massive quantity of sophisticated weapons that we provided to Ukraine. So yes, we do think about what are the implications of our support and the nature of our support and the amount and extent and sophistication, but we also don't have that question stop us from doing what we believe is necessary to give Ukraine the tools it needs to succeed on the battlefield.
Do one quick turn in the few minutes that we have left. Do one quick turn on this normalization issue. Israel and Saudi Arabia. What are the chances that it would really happen? And I want a precise number.
You sound very sold on the prospect based on that.
Yeah, what? And why pursue this? Is this sort of a proxy way of renormalizing relations with the Saudis by using Israel as a pathway to the Saudis? I mean, explain to people what's going on.
Well, when we came into office, you had the war in Yemen raging as the world's largest humanitarian catastrophe. You had, a few months before we came in, our embassy in Baghdad stormed, and Secretary of State Pompeo going out and talking about pulling the entire American mission out of Iraq. You had Iranian groups in both Syria and Iraq firing missiles at US forces. All of that's what we walked into. And what we said is we want to depressurize, de-escalate, and ultimately integrate the Middle East region. The war in Yemen is in its 19-month of truce. For now, the Iranian attacks against US forces have stopped. Our presence in Iraq is stable. I emphasize for now because all of that can change. And the Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades. Now, challenges remain. Iran's nuclear weapons program, the tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. But the amount of time that I have to spend on crisis and conflict in the Middle East today compared to any of my predecessors going back to 9/11 is significantly reduced. So what are we trying to do with Saudi and Israel? Reinforce, deepen, and sustain that out into the future, because we believe that regional integration and normalization between significant countries in the Middle East can create a greater and more stable foundation as we go forward. We also believe that a necessary dimension of that is real progress for the Palestinians as well, which is an important element of the discussions that we're having with both the Israelis and the Palestinians. So that's what this is about. And because we're out of time, I can't give you a number, a percentage.
But here's the interesting thing. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, so I can overrule the clock.
I will just note that the only number I see in here is 0, 0, 0.
It says 0, 0,
And I would
0.
say the percentage chance is higher than that.
Higher than absolute 0. Let me ask you one final question, because I'm not going to get an answer. Let me ask you one final question. It's almost 3 years now you've been doing this. I have a weakness for the word doctrine. Can you define for us in a few words what you think this president's overarching foreign policy doctrine is? Or is he kind of allergic to the idea of having a kind of unitary principle of foreign policy?
Can I have many words rather than a few words to describe the doctrine?
You want, like I said, now the clock works all of a sudden. Yeah, sure.
Well, I'll give you, I was about to do a teaser for a piece I'm writing, but since it's not for The Atlantic, I won't do that. I'm sorry. I apologize. It's too long. They would have never published it. It's too long.
Do you know how long our pieces are?
It's too long.
He wrote a very good, look it up. He wrote a very good piece about his own personal foreign policy doctrine a few years ago. It's very good.
So it goes back to something I was saying earlier in the conversation. We believe that the post-Cold War era has come to an end, and there's a competition underway for what comes next. And we believe at the heart of that is basically an era of geopolitical competition in an age of interdependence. And so that at once we have to improve America's competitive edge against our major power competitors and improve America's capacity to rally the world to solve significant challenges. And that basically comes down to 4 simple pillars. Invest in the sources of American strength at home, build out and modernize our alliances and partnerships, deliver a better value proposition to the global South, where we have been, I think, too absent for too long, and then be disciplined in the use of our power. And in part, being disciplined in the use of our power means ending America's longest war, not getting involved directly in new wars, and standing up to Russian aggression in Ukraine in a way that is both powerful and responsible. And that's basically the Biden approach. And we believe that if we do all of those things, we will leave America stronger and more strategically well-positioned than we found it. And we will create some durable basis upon which we can succeed in the competition in this age of interdependence going forward. And I'll leave the rest of it to the pages of some other outfit.
Yeah,
that
no,
you can
and I look forward to your article in Us Magazine. It's gonna be fantastic. 27,000 words on Kosovo.
They do have the stars, they're just like us thing.
Yeah. National Security Advisors, they're just like us.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much. Thanks.
thank you all. We're going to ask everyone to please remain seated for a few minutes while the speakers depart. Thank you so much for being here with us for the conversation with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, with Jeffrey Goldberg, Will Hurd, and with Evan Smith. We hope that you'll come back right here at 3:15. We're doing a screening of the documentary Bad Press here on the Pier stage. And please enjoy the rest of the festival. Again, just remain seated for a couple of minutes. Thank you so much.